excess deaths in the UK right now are higher than they were at any time during COVID. So if you remember during COVID, the daily briefings, here's the number of deaths, here's the number of hospitalisations, here's this, here's that. The number of excess deaths right now is higher than at that time when we had daily briefings and daily death counts and people petrified into their own homes and people glued to the TV screens to see just how bad things were in their area and wondering what they could do about it and wanting to get more information about it. Currently, the situation is worse than at any of that time, and yet absolutely nothing at all is being said. And the thing that really troubles me from a behind the kind of screens media side of this is that it's almost as if the story is actively being hidden as opposed to not being talked about. So the actual numbers are about 1,500 excess deaths a week. The last figure for the last week was 1,646 excess deaths. So that's deaths over the average. And consistently for the last few months, the excess death figure has been higher than at any time for the last 5 years. So on a comparative scale over the last 5 years, excess deaths are now way higher than they ever were. And this isn't just a UK problem. This is being seen in Australia, where I think they're running at around 18% higher than is average or usual. And there's some very interesting other things about these excess deaths. One way that the media is trying to kind of divide them up is to talk about different groups of excess deaths. So you're going to hear the figure 300 to 500 excess deaths a week. That's just referring to A&E, the state of the NHS, and the fact that people that go to A&E aren't being dealt with quick enough, aren't being seen, can't get to a bed, can't get the treatment they need. So not to disregard the 3 to 500 figure, but that is actually, you could say subterfuge, you could say that is actually a distraction. The real number of excess deaths that are unexplained in many ways each week are 1,600 in the last week that was measured, that we have on record. And that's been measured by 3 different ways. So it's not just like one person's metric that we're talking about here. The other really strange thing about these figures that no one is talking about, or people are actively not talking about, is that a third more individuals in this excess death category are dying in their own homes. So I suppose when you think about that, if you know you're sick or you know you're ill, possibly you're in A&E, or if you know you're sick or ill, you're in hospital, or if you're elderly and frail and probably not doing too well, maybe you're in a care home, or maybe you're even in hospice. Those would be different kind of environments where you might be expected to die if you weren't doing so well. A third of these excess deaths are happening to people who are just pottering around their own homes as if they didn't know they had anything wrong with them at all. And that should strike most ordinary people as being quite odd. There's a particular category as well where excess deaths are particularly high, and that's in men aged around 50 to 64, and it seems to correlate strongly with heart problems. And that group is being severely affected by these excess deaths. And just so you don't separate excess deaths as some sort of thing over there or some sort of, I don't know, something that's separate from life. Excess deaths mean people are just dying in their own homes that didn't necessarily realise they were unwell. Otherwise, they would have presented themselves to a hospital or an A&E or a doctor's surgery, or would be in a hospice or a care home. So that's particularly odd. The other thing that's really odd when you think about it, if you're willing to, and this really is a question of who's willing to think about this, let alone talk about it, which won't make me terribly popular in the usual circles, is that there is a communications void. And this goes back to my earlier point that it's not just that this isn't being talked about, it's not just this isn't actively being distracted from, which I'd argue people talking about 300 excess deaths in A&E, that's a distraction from this main point, because 1,646 is clearly a larger number. We are talking about over 200 people dying a day that probably shouldn't be, just in the UK alone. but it's that there is a communications void, and I can almost feel it from my media days. There's a sucking out of the oceans like before a tsunami, except the tsunami of information will never come. It is actively being suppressed, and I can feel it. Remember those daily briefings. Remember how they pulled in Chris Whitty because people liked that he seemed kind of odd. They liked that he looked like he'd never had sex in his life and he never blinked and he was a very odd scientist. And that really held people's attention. Next slide, please. And there was another guy, do you remember him? Patrick Vallance. They used him a lot because he had a different way of being. He talked about football and he was like kind of a scientist, but yet kind of cool. They used him. They had these two different approaches for two different audiences to get their messaging across. A daily briefing at number 10 for deaths that were at a rate that is lower than now, when no one is prepared to talk about it at all. In fact, information is being actively suppressed. And you can say, well, so what, Katie? Well, so what? A lot of our fellow countrymen are dying and no one wants to talk about it. And these are numbers that are quite clearly, it doesn't matter if it's me saying it, go find someone else or go look it up for yourself. You will find the numbers without my commentary. The other thing that's very concerning, whether you give a shit about 200 people plus dying a day that shouldn't be or not, is the fact that if you were to assert that this was due to lockdown, it's that almost as if lockdown is a thing, like something with like a pen, lockdown. And people say, well, it's possibly due to lockdown, as if it was to blame on this pen, and therefore this pen, well, there's nothing more to be said. It's quite possibly lockdown was to blame. But of course, lockdown wasn't this inanimate object, was it? Lockdown was a decision-making moment by leaders of this country. It was enabled and pushed by the science. Celebrities and the media worked together to push lockdown. You can think of individuals, I am sure, Piers Morgan, who actively said that people who refused to be vaccinated should be locked down and never let out again. Lockdown wasn't an inanimate object. Lockdown was a group of human beings who foisted their desires onto another group of people, for many of whom, including myself, that was done unwillingly, to the point where most of us, or many of us, rejected all ideas about lockdown, to the point of being deported from entire countries. Lockdown, as people keep saying, well, perhaps it's due to lockdown. But it wasn't lockdown. It was the people that made lockdown happen. This is the infuriating thing and the point that I'm desperately trying to get to. Lockdown isn't an inanimate thing. It's not a noun, despite the fact that it is. It's a collective of individuals who imposed their will, which has been crushingly harmful to the point of excess deaths on others, and no one is calling them out on it. No one is being allowed to give voice to it, and no one will be held accountable for it. And I can think of thousands of people who have been in touch with me to say that they've lost their family, they've lost their friends, they've been called a conspiracy theorist, they've been called tinfoil hat. It's not about whether those people were right or wrong, or whether someone like myself, who has been speaking of this for 4 years, has been proven to be, alongside many other people, largely right, that lockdowns would harm us more than anything ever. It's the fact that no one who was pushing lockdown is holding up their hands and saying this is a bad idea, I was wrong, because they're not being obliged to, because these figures are being suppressed. And if you take it to another level where you start to bring in vaccine injuries and put a query over whether that might be partly to blame, well, then you have to be eviscerated from the face of the planet. So keep your eye out for the excess death numbers. Please ignore me, but do have a look at them for yourself, because I assure you they're shocking. And then please have a look at the way the media are not addressing this. And then please take a listen to excess death figures that you hear. Because if you hear the figure 300, that's just a tiny slice of the pie chart, and you are being actively misled. And I would like to pose a further question to charities like the British Heart Foundation. And my question to you, and a question that I am going to bring to your offices direct with my camera, is where the hell are you at a time when there are record deaths with heart conditions that have gone undiagnosed, leading to people dying in their own home, and no one, including you, the British Heart Foundation, being willing to talk about it? Why not send me an email, katie@katiehopkins.co.uk.